Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, yesterday, the EU Withdrawal Bill, which would convert all current EU law into UK law after Brexit, was introduced for its second reading in the House of Commons. We'll show you a bit of that debate later, but although the attention this week has been focused on life after we leave the EU, the battle to define how Brexit actually happens goes on inside the government and opposition. So where exactly are the fault lines? Tories concerned about the consequences of withdrawal from the single market and customs union, that's people like Nicky Morgan and Anna Soubry, have criticised the withdrawal bill for giving ministers too much power over how to incorporate EU law. But Theresa May's facing pressure from another side too, the much larger Eurosceptic group of Conservative MPs. Yesterday, a letter emerged in which dozens urged the Prime Minister not to stay in the EU by stealth. The letter was circulated among a social media group containing two junior members of the government, Brexit Minister Steve Baker and Treasury aide Suella Fernandez. Labour has agreed a three-line whip on its MPs to oppose the EU withdrawal bill as it stands. The party's Brexit spokesman Keir Starmer says Labour wants to stay in the single market and customs union during a transition. But it's divided on the nature of the final deal with the EU. One group of Labour MPs, including former shadow ministers Heidi Alexander and Alison McGovern, is campaigning for permanent membership of the single market. But Labour's 2017 manifesto said freedom of movement will end after Brexit, something John McDonnell has said is absolutely clear. There's expected to be lots of pressure at the party's conference from the Labour campaign for free movement, backed by people like Clive Lewis for a rethink. Backing that campaign is the former union leader, Billy Hayes. He is here with me now in the studio, and also joining us is the businessman and founder of Labour Leave, John Mills. Thank you both for being here. Billy, what exactly do you want to do at conference? Will you be setting a motion down on this issue?
Well, that's still being debated as to what's going to be discussed, but very much we want to be in favour of the continuation of free movement of Labour. The decision of Keir Starmer on the front bench is a good move in the right direction. So the third part of that has got to be a continuation of free movement.
But only till the end of a transitional deal.
Well, let's just deal with where we are at the moment. We've yet to see the whole of Brexit, the disaster that's Brexit played out yet. So it's, at this stage, we're campaigning there needs to be the continuation of the free movement of Labour.
And just to be clear, you've signed up to a campaign with a commitment defending and extending the free movement of people in the context of the debate around Brexit. So do you ultimately want to make it easier for people to come here?
Well, I think the big thing is that immigration and the free movement has been a good thing for this country and is a good thing. The world's most successful economy is built on, like the USA. It has been built on immigration, and immigration has been good for this country. And that's what the Labour campaign for free movement is about, is a continuation of free movement, which has been good for the UK and is good for our economy.
And just to be clear, in 2016, people voted for Brexit. Do you not accept that limiting free movement was part of that vote?
Well, the polls, that's obviously was a part, the whole question of immigration. But there's a recent YouGov poll that said that people would accept free movement of Labour if there was a deal on the single market. That was a YouGov poll. So yes, obviously immigration was a factor, but you know, the fact of the matter is free movement of Labour in this country has been a good thing.
And John, you know, they're basically saying that it's the best way to protect and advance the interests of all workers. What do you say to that?
Well, I'm not at all sure that's right. I think what's happened in this country is that we've had a large amount of immigration from people from Eastern Europe with low income expectations who have come in and competed quite strongly at the lower end of the labour market. And the Bank of England produced a report showing that, in fact, this was depressing wages. And I think
depressing wages very slightly, and it was only one report that is obviously quoted quite heavily. And the Bank of England have actually made that smaller since then.
Well, I think that there is controversy and doubt about exactly the extent to which this has happened. But it's very hard to believe that having large numbers of people coming in who are quite prepared to work for low wages and people who have got lots of aspirations and prepared to work hard doesn't have some effect on the labour market. And I think also because we've had such a big influx of people who are prepared to work for low wages, this has discouraged investment in the UK. Productivity has been stuck in this country for nearly 10 years now. So I think there are downsides to having complete free movement of labour. I think that what the Labour Party really needs to do, and the country needs to do, is to put some constraints on labour there, but have as free a movement as we possibly can of people who are on high incomes and who have the skills that the economy really needs.
And Billy, how do you respond to that, the idea that there has been an impact on lower paid workers?
Well, you yourself have just said that that's debatable about what it's done to wages in this country. But you know what's interesting is the reaction to the Tory proposals. A friend of mine was trying to get through to the office of the CBI yesterday, and the switchboard was jammed with businesses saying that recent Tory proposals are
So you're talking about the leaked proposals that suggest a pretty big crackdown?
Yeah, and in the CBI, the switchboard was jammed yesterday with people trying to get through to say, what is this nonsense they're talking about in terms of restriction of low skill, this leak you talk about. So I think...
Well, you say that businesses were talking about that. We didn't hear very much from the Labour front bench. Even Diane Abbott, the Shadow Home Secretary, who we know is somebody who has talked about the virtues of free movement, hardly had anything to say about that leaked document.
Well, I can't speak for the Labour front bench. What I can say is that Labour Campaign for Free Movement is about supporting those people in the party and wider society who think immigration has been good for this country and is helped with... in lots of areas. There was a woman on the other day on the TV talking about the impact on care homes if these restrictions go in, as I say, and the CBI is, as we all know, is against the government proposals.
I know you can't speak for the Labour front bench, but presumably you know quite a lot of the figures who are on the front bench. Do you know if any of them are supporting your position?
Well, we've got some MP support, and I couldn't tell you the whole list, but former front bench member Clive Lewis is one of the supporters of the Labour campaign.
But without naming them, are there people in the front bench?
Well, I'm not going to say if I know people on the front bench who are supporting the Labour campaign for free movement of labour. But, I think this campaign is going to take off because people see if we're going to be in a single market, if we're going to be in a customs union, then the logic of that, there needs to be free movement of labour as well.
But Labour went into the election saying free movement will end. John McDonnell has said it, Keir Starmer has said it, Jeremy Corbyn has said it.
Yeah, I'm not speaking for the Labour front benches. I'm speaking for those people in the party who think...
But you think that Labour should go against its manifesto?
Well, it wouldn't be the first time any party's gone against what it said in its manifesto. But the point being is that we need to stiffen the sinews of those in the party who believe that the free movement of labour in this country, in Europe, has been a good thing for Britain.
And John, this is really challenging for Labour because there are voters on both sides of this divide and they're very passionate.
I think they are, but I think there's a large majority in the country who are in favour of a reasonable amount of immigration but aren't in favour of completely unrestricted immigration. And if Billy's campaign is going to allow everybody in from the EU, why don't we let everybody in from all over the world? I mean, there seems to be some illogicality about all this.
And what did you think of the leaked proposals from the government about a post-Brexit system?
I thought they were far too restrictive and draconian.
So what sort of system would you like to see?
Well, I think we need some constraints on free movement of labour from Eastern Europe, but as free a system as we can possibly devise for people who the economy needs for all sorts of purposes, and some of them are highly skilled and some of them are other people like picking fruit.
OK. And Jack, where's all this going to go at Labour conference?
It's going to be a bun fight. I mean, you've seen there, this debate is happening right the way through the Labour Party at the moment. And Keir Starmer, the Shadow Brexit Secretary, has manoeuvred the party quite cleverly into a position without too much of trouble. But if you speak quietly, and I'm sure you've done it yourself, to certain Labour MPs, particularly ones from northern constituencies where a lot of people voted Brexit, they're very nervous about Labour's current position on this. They're very worried that their voters are going to turn around and say, hang on, you're trying to stop Brexit happening altogether. And
that said, Isabel, in the election, Jeremy Corbyn did say he'd end free movement, but when asked if the numbers would come down, he said, maybe, which suggests that they did pretty well in the election without going too hard on immigration.
Well, I mean, I found Billy's interview there quite extraordinary, really. I mean, you blithely talk about it being possible to renege on your manifesto. The recent history of parties that just blithely ignore their manifesto commitments isn't exactly a pretty one. Look what happened to the Liberal Democrats. The Tories have learnt a few things to their cost as well. And I found it extraordinary that you weren't challenged on the claim that Brexit is a disaster. Labour. Where is your evidence for that? We haven't got Brexit yet. And furthermore, you know, you repeatedly claim that people want free movement of people. Well, the result of the Brexit referendum was clearly indicating that people do want an end of free movement of people. And I find it very strange that you continue to press for this, and I think your campaign is going nowhere.
Billy?
Well, it wouldn't be the first time a journalist has told me the campaign I was involved in is going nowhere. But what is definite...
But it is a good point, isn't it? You know, you make promises in an election and you can't just break them. And then also, how do you know that Brexit's going to be a disaster?
Well, I think if you talk to the business community about the impact of the talks, we haven't even left the EU yet, and the impact of the talks. If you talk to people in business and the CBI, they can see what's looming large in terms of, you know, if we're going to be in a single market, just on what's currently being mentioned, and the customs union, as it seems to be moving towards.
Where do you get that from? That's not the case. We're not going to remain in the single market and the customs union.
Right,
that's not the government position.
That's the Labour position only during transition.
Yeah, that's the Labour position, but the fact of the matter is what's looking like that's what's going to happen. And
but
if you're in
like
the single market,
yeah?
if you're in the single market, you must support the free movement of Labour. That's, you know, and I don't... But
are you saying that Labour should keep that as a permanent position then?
I don't speak for the Labour Party. I'm speaking for this campaign. At the moment, we're campaigning to make sure...
But you are running to be representative of the Conference Arrangements Committee, which is a very influential committee in what's discussed at conference.
Yeah.
In fact, the ballot has just closed.
That's right.
A few minutes ago.
Yeah.
So you do speak for the Labour Party to some extent.
I haven't been elected yet. I don't know whether I'm going to be elected. So I can't take responsibility for a Conference Arrangements Committee I haven't been elected to. Look, all the people who were for Brexit, you know, the Mail and all the various journals and all the rest of it, the fact of the matter is that free movement of labour in this country, in the European Union, has been a good thing for this.
I think that's a controversial claim. I don't think you can justify that.
How damaging, John, could this be for the Labour Party, these differences?
Well, I don't think it helps getting the Labour Party elected for the next general election to have all these differences. I think it would be much better if the Labour Party could coalesce around a policy and support the government and unite the country as much as possible on these negotiations. I mean, it is difficult, but I think that's what Labour ought to be doing, rather than further and further dividing the country by some of the sorts of proposals we've heard. OK,
we'll be keeping an eye on all of it. Now, as we mentioned earlier, yesterday MPs began debating the EU Withdrawal Bill, which will transfer existing EU law onto the UK statute book. The bill has been controversial because of the inclusion of so-called Henry VIII powers, which would give ministers the freedom to make changes to the law without full parliamentary scrutiny. Here's a flavour of the exchanges.
Put simply, this bill is an essential step. Whilst it does not take us out of the European Union, that's a matter for the Article 50 process, it does ensure that on the day we leave, businesses know where they stand, workers' rights are upheld and consumers remain protected. This bill is vital to ensuring that as we leave, we do so in an orderly manner.
The Secretary of State keen to portray this bill as a technical exercise converting EU law into our law without raising any serious constitutional issues about the role of Parliament. Nothing could be further from the truth. Yeah. The UK is leaving the EU. That we are leaving is settled. How we leave is not. This bill invites us to surrender all power and influence over that question to the government and to ministers. That will betray everything that we were sent here to do.
This is clearly a necessary piece of legislation. If we start from the simple principle how necessary this is, the idea that we have to get all of that European law and regulations, etc., transposed into UK law, applicable and actionable in UK law properly, so that it is properly justiciable at the end of the day.
They said that this would be this great opportunity to get rid of all those rules and regulations, miles of red tape, all these things that were strangling British business and the economy. And these are the very same things we are going to take lock, stock and barrel and place into substantive British law.
The government claims the bill will restore sovereignty to Parliament and secure certainty post-Brexit, but that is not the case. It transfers huge powers to ministers, not to members of this House, over issues that are vital to people's lives, like maternity and paternity leave, holidays, environmental standards and a whole range of other issues.
We have got to make sure, Madam Deputy Speaker, that on the day of exit, the statute book in this country works. And frankly, the only way that we can achieve it in the timescale with which we're constrained and which is set out in Article 50 is to have a flexible, pragmatic system such as the system that is laid out in the draft bill.
This is an absolutely vital bill. We cannot leave the European Union sensibly without such a bill being on the statute book. Unless this bill is substantially improved in the course of the committee stage, I regret to have to say to my right honourable friends and honourable friends, I would be in no position to support it at third reading in its current form. It is in many respects an astonishing monstrosity of a bill.
Well, a little earlier I spoke to the Tory MP, Charlie Elphicke. I began by asking him whether he understood why some of his Conservative colleagues were so uncomfortable with handing the so-called Henry VIII statutory powers to Whitehall.
Well, we've had Henry VIII powers in our legislation for many, many years. And indeed, in the European Communities Act, back in the early 70s, has the biggest Henry VIII powers of all. European law is simply brought straight into our legislation without any parliamentary scrutiny whatsoever. With this bill, we actually get parliamentary scrutiny on transcribing European law into our own domestic legislation.
So, just to be clear then, Dominic Grieve is wrong when he calls it an astonishing monstrosity?
I think Dominic has obviously got concerns about that. I respect those concerns. But my biggest concern is how we make sure that we get on with the task of Brexit. My constituents raise with me the issues about money, the issues about making sure there aren't queues at Dover. They don't raise with me the issues about parliamentary scrutiny. They want to make sure that we're focused on making sure we have an effective Brexit that works for Britain.
Yeah, but we have a parliamentary mathematics at the moment, which is going to make things quite difficult for you. And we know that the Labour Party is really worried about these powers, which will essentially allow the government to change regulations without parliamentary scrutiny. Do you think the government's going to have to concede on some of these points?
Well, there is parliamentary scrutiny because each of these regulations, about 1,000 regulations in all, can be called in and voted on separately in Parliament. And in fact, if Parliament voted on each regulation and debated each regulation, it'd be doing nothing between now and Brexit Day. So yes, we need scrutiny where it's appropriate, but we also need to get on with the task at hand, to make sure we transcribe European law into our domestic legislation, and then we can then move on with the many other aspects of Brexit.
In which case, do you think that colleagues who vote against aspects of the bill are essentially voting against Brexit?
I'm not saying that at all. I think the really important thing is that we have this bill, it's a process bill, we put in place the machinery to bring European law into British law, we pass these regulations to do that transcription process, and then over time, clearly, as we've taken back control of our legal system, we can look at the detail of the laws and see what works for Britain and what doesn't.
Now, a number of your colleagues have signed this letter that was going to be published in a Sunday newspaper to Theresa May, essentially saying do not allow a transitional period to keep us in the EU by stealth. Will you be adding your name to that letter?
This is not a letter right for me. I thought it was too prescriptive, but it was very much not aimed at our government. It was aimed at the Labour Party, who have changed their position since the general election. They had an election manifesto that said that they would end uncontrolled immigration, leave the single market. They said they would take back control of trade policy, leave the customs union, and they performed a massive U-turn, talking about a transitional period without end. A bit like Hotel California. You can check out any time you like, but you can never leave.
So you're saying this isn't aimed at Theresa May?
No, not at all. The government has been really clear. They said, look, we're leaving the single market.
Why do you need a letter then? The Labour Party isn't making the policy.
We're leaving the single market, we're leaving the customs union, we're going to finish up implementation period by the time of the next general election. Labour has done a U-turn, and this letter is about highlighting how Labour have backsliding and are having this transition period without any end.
And, you're part of this group, the European Research Group, which is Tory backbenchers essentially pushing to make sure that Brexit happens. It's chaired by your colleague Suella Fernandez, and she, it appears, has circulated this letter among colleagues. Some people are saying that, as such, she should lose her position as a government aide to the Treasury.
I don't accept that at all. The European Research Group is what it says on the tin. It's a group that looks at and researches into all the laws which are going through Parliament at the moment on Brexit. It includes people who backed Leave, includes people like me who backed Remain. All of us are united by taking a real interest in making sure we have a Brexit that works for Britain.
But you are very much pushing for Brexit to take place. And this letter, some might say, is essentially lobbying the government.
Well, it's not that we're pushing for Brexit to take place. We're pushing to make sure the referendum is respected, the instruction of the British people to leave the European Union is respected, that we take back control of our borders, end uncontrolled EU immigration, and make sure that we have a trade policy which is made in London and Britain and not in Brussels.
But look, some of your colleagues have been pretty angry about this letter. Stephen Hammond said that rebel MPs should sign and resign. That might include Suella, but also, although he hasn't signed it, there is some talk about Steve Baker, who used to run your group and now is a Brexit minister and appears to have added his name to a WhatsApp group perhaps around it. Nicky Morgan, meanwhile, says it's not fair for ministers to be heavily involved in backbench affairs when they are involved in collective responsibility. Do you disagree with Stephen Hammond and Nicky Morgan?
I think they've misunderstood. They've misunderstood what this letter is about. It's not aimed at the government, it's aimed at the Labour Party. They're hopelessly split on the whole issue of Brexit. You've got Jeremy Corbyn, who seems to want to leave. You've got the rest of the Labour MPs who seem to want to defy the referendum and remain in Europe. And what we're highlighting is, a transition period without end is not leaving the European Union.
You say it's for the Labour Party, but is it addressed to Jeremy Corbyn, this letter?
It's addressed to set out what should happen and that there should be a transition period with an end. And that is government policy.
But who is it being sent to? Who's the recipient of the letter?
I was not signatory of this letter. I don't know what the purpose of this letter is, but I've read the text, and the text is very clearly that there should be a transition period with an end. And that is the current government policy, and the Labour Party has shifted their position. They've done a U-turn, and the concern is that they want us to remain in the European Union by stealth.
So you're certain it's not to Theresa May, it's not in any way trying to lobby government policy?
I think the government have a really clear position. I think the most important thing is not letters, not process. It's making sure we have a Brexit that works for Britain, supporting the government in their negotiations with Brussels. And the real question is, how do we make sure that Brussels gets on with the negotiations so we can give more certainty to the businesses and people of this country in what Brexit is going to look like.
And you're very comfortable with Suella both leading your ERG group but also being in government?
Well, Suella is an outstanding ministerial aide. She works really hard, does a great job in the Treasury. Steve Baker has made a flying start as a minister. They're both excellent people and they deserve to be supported.
Conservative MP Charlie Elphicke talking to me earlier. So, Isabel, was this letter designed to lobby government?
Well, I think what the letter shows is a scale of concern within the Tory parliamentary party about the possibility of a rather elongated transition period. And there are differing views within the cabinet about how long the transition period should last. I think there is an acceptance on the part of even the most strident Brexit ministers that there has to be a transition period and that will be probably around 2 years and it must have a full stop. But as Charlie Elphicke there was saying, the grave concern is about Labour's position and the idea that they want to continue the so-called transitionary period until everything is worked out. Now, that is a how long is a piece of string situation. And in fairness, you can't blame Labour and people like Keir Starmer for wanting to extend it for as long as possible because they don't believe we should leave anyway.
But, Jack, there is this group, the European Research Group. They say they're just there to do a bit of research on Brexit and it's all government policy. It's led by Suella Fernandez, who interestingly is an aide to the Treasury, which is led by Philip Hammond, who I suspect is one of the people Isabel is talking about when there's disagreements in the cabinet.
Yeah, and she's definitely sailing close to the wind. I mean, it's a matter for Theresa May how her ministers or their aides act and what she thinks is acceptable and what isn't.
Because Steve Baker actually resigned from the group.
Right, exactly. And the one thing that Charlie Elphicke said there, I think was a little disingenuous when he said this group is just what it is. It's a European research group. They've clearly come up with the most boring sounding name for their caucus that they possibly can to make it sound as uninteresting and sinister as it can. What it actually is a very powerful...
Is it sinister?
Well, it's
Jack,
it's
come
operating.
On, if that's your definition of sinister, I think that a lot of things are going to spook you out.
But isn't there an issue here that Theresa May is dealing with real big competing factions in her party?
That's it. And what's interesting about it as well is the way that WhatsApp, this messaging service, has suddenly had this big impact in Parliament because it's allowing MPs to organise very quickly and effectively. And I'm sure the other side are doing it as well. We just don't know the name of their WhatsApp group yet. But it's actually allowing them to be very disciplined disciplined, they can speak to each other all the way through the day. People aren't just coming out and saying things, they can...
Or rather indisciplined,
well,
making trouble. I mean, I think it's worth pointing out that the ministerial aid concerned Suella, she's not a senior figure in the government, PPSs, they're not paid, it's a bottom rung of the ladder, as it were. And I don't think this is an excessively disloyal manoeuvre. We're in a very heated period for Brexit debate, and this is just a bunch of MPs who want to make sure that the government stands firm against what's an awful lot of noises off.
So you think, no question, that she should lose her job over this?
In my view, no, but it's not up to me.
I think it's unlikely, but partly for just the reason that Theresa May is not in a strong position to do anything that might upset, such a big number of her
And isn't that one of the problems? Because she's got no majority, actually both sides of this debate are essentially holding her prisoner to some extent.
That's exactly right. And yesterday we saw her having two rebellions from different parts of her party on the same day in the Commons. We saw it earlier, people like Dominic Greaves attacking her bill to get Brexit through, and then on the same day the other side of the party putting together this lobbying letter to try and hold her feet to the fire of how hard Brexit is. She's in an impossible position, and there really isn't anything she can do about it because she has no Commons majority.
And Isabel, those people like Dominic Grieve who are really laying into the EU withdrawal bill, do you think they're essentially trying to scupper Brexit?
I wouldn't go that far. I mean, I have the greatest respect for Dominic Grieve. He argued very powerfully yesterday. He did make the point, though, that the bill itself is essential. I think that there is a bit of using this as a proxy for just a fundamental anti-Brexit position. I mean, I read the editor of the Evening Standard, George Osborne's column on this yesterday, his editorial, and I expected to disagree with every word of it and actually found myself rather attracted to his rhetoric, to talk about the importance of Parliament and democracy. It sounds brilliant, but remember, a lot of these powers are ones that we blithely nodded away to Brussels, and all we're doing is bringing them back here. So I didn't hear all these people making a hue and a cry every time we transferred this and that regulation from our own jurisdiction over to Brussels.
Well, we'll be hearing lots more about that next week.